market that we operate in is incredibly complicated. There's lots of different operating models out there. And even within one of the channels, if we take discounting, for example, even within discounting, there are lots of ways of doing it. So the grocery market organisation is incredibly diverse. And I've just given you here a very simplified view of what it looks like, splitting down sales across the major retail channels. Some of our retailers, of course, like Asda or Tesco or Sainsbury's, they're present in multiple channels. So they're multi-channel operators. Gives them access to shoppers in lots of different situations. But of course, the more complex your business is, the more costly, the more difficult it is to operate it efficiently. Lots of other retailers dedicated to just one channel. So if you think about people like McColl's, for example, just doing convenience retail. But diversification, always an option, even if you are a specialist. And if we look at the discounters, for example, discounters now becoming increasingly flexible. And Aldi, at least, is starting to experiment with online sales as well. And that's an important point, because the structure that we're seeing here is not rigid. It's very fluid, it's potentially very dynamic. And one of the key trends that we're seeing at the moment is this idea of channel blur, the divisions between the different types of operation starting to be rubbed away. We can break down sales in a couple of different ways. And in fact, a lack of really consistent category definitions and category data is obviously one of the barriers that we have to data exchange in the industry. So what I've done is I've tried to sidestep any potential rows and just break it down across the major product categories. So we can take a couple of points from this chart. First of all, the non-grocery sales through grocery stores, top left, non-grocery sales through grocery stores, that's things like clothing, electricals, home entertainment. That's about £13 billion per year. So that means that grocery retailers now take about 14% of all non-grocery retail. So they're quite a significant threat to high street specialists, particularly people like the clothing chains. Food and drink sales, about £114 billion per year. So food and drink is about 2/3 of everything that is being moved by the grocery retail industry. And it's not just about the profitability, it's not just about the cash generation. These categories absolutely central to what these retailers are. So their ability to perform in the food and drink markets, it's central to the image, it's central to the essence of the company. And that's why these retailers spend so much time talking about food values as well as food value. And the last point I'd pull out there is notice the strength of food and drink retail. So food and drink is about £48 billion per year at food service. So food service, it's not really food retail, but it is an alternative way of getting food and drink. So there's a constant fight going on there for share of stomach and also for share of wallet. And arguably, I think we could say that in some cases food and drinks food service is more dynamic, more innovative than it is at retail. And very often you see new food trends being trialled in a food service environment before being transferred across to food retail. In terms of retailer shares, the market actually looks like this. This is Kantar data. And again, we can take a couple of things from the chart. The first thing is that the market is actually dominated, as it has been for many years, by 4 large retailers: Tesco, Sainsbury's, Asda and Morrisons. But really all 4 of them have struggled to extend their share in the last couple of years. What we can see though is that Aldi and Lidl have grown quite significantly over that time. Aldi particularly has actually doubled its size in the last 5 or 6 years. If we look at growth performance, well, on the face of it, it looks as if the discounters have actually got it all their own way. But this is a chart that's actually changed hugely in the last year or so. So if I showed you this chart with data for 2016, March 2016, what you would see is that Lidl and Aldi were growing much, much faster, and they were accounting for virtually all of the growth that's available in the marketplace. What's happened in the last year is that Aldi and Lidl have slowed down quite abruptly, whereas the bigger operators, Morrisons, Tesco, particularly, have actually refreshed themselves and actually started to revive their growth performance. And as they get their traction back, it might well be much harder in future for discounters to drive market development. They'll have much more of a fight on their hands to expand themselves any further. One factor that might drive growth in the future is inflation, of course. That's in the news today. We just had the latest inflation data from ONS. And what we now know is that food and drink is back in positive inflation territory after 3 years, nearly, of prices going backwards. Now, a lot of shoppers, of course, are going to be quite sensitive to this idea of food prices going up after going backwards for an extended period. But if you work in the food industry, you might have a much more nuanced view of what food inflation actually means. Certainly food inflation makes it harder to grow your volumes, makes it harder to switch shoppers into more premium products. But at the same time, if your prices are starting to come up, to some extent it might make your life a little bit easier, because it makes it easier to achieve your sales targets, your profit targets, your return on investment targets. So to some extent, a little bit of food price inflation, not necessarily a bad thing. But of course, shoppers will probably have a different view of that. So inflation, we know, absolutely central to determining economic outcomes for most households. It plays a very powerful role in shaping shopper mood, shaping shopper confidence and behaviour. And at IGD, we've actually got a really good idea of how shoppers feel, how shoppers think, because we talk to 1,700 shoppers every single month through Shopper Vista. And you might have a subscription to that at your desk. And what our data shows us is that a lot of shoppers are preoccupied with this idea that future grocery bills are going to be higher. And at the moment, 81% of our shoppers, 81% of the shoppers we spoke to in February think prices are going to go up in future. And as you look at the chart, what you can see is that it actually steps up from around September, October of last year. So we've actually got record high concern on this particular question. And undoubtedly that's associated with Brexit. There's been an awful lot of coverage of Brexit and what it's going to mean for prices and inflation within the consumer press. And that, I think, is what's being reflected in the data that we're getting on Shopper Vista. And historically, we know convenience, discounting and online have tended to account for the bulk of market growth, and we would expect that that's going to continue. So channel shift, which is already in play, is going to continue in the post-Brexit world. Notice, though, that even though convenience, discounting and online will grow fastest, even 5 years from now, most of the goods being sold by our industry are still going to be going through big stores. So it's actually the big stores that are going to continue to be the key battleground for our industry. And certainly all of the retailers are going to have a really strong interest in making sure that those big stores continue to perform. And so will all of the suppliers as well, because of course suppliers have made a huge investment in big store performance over the course of many years. So the suppliers also have an interest in making sure that those big stores aren't allowed to wither on the vine. They have to continue to perform into the future. One of the wildcard factors that will determine the future value of our industry, of course, is food service, and particularly food service in the food-to-go format. Now, we know that food service competes with retail. It competes for share of stomach, competes for prestige, competes for share of wallet. That's always been an issue. But the issue of overlap between retail and food service is getting more urgent, because now we have this idea of food to go. And food to go is actually a sort of intermediate solution between retail and regular food service. It makes food service as cheap and as convenient as retail is. So actually food to go might potentially erode away the sales of both retail and conventional food service. And there is no disputing that food to go is attracting a huge amount of attention at the moment. It's seen a surge of investment by established food businesses and new entrant businesses as well. And we think food to go is going to grow by about 35% over the next 5 years, which would compare to maybe 10% growth for regular food retail. So no surprise that both retailers and suppliers are really keen to get into that.